"Warren, we are losing $300,000 an hour," Paul stated inside the armored SUV. "The permit expires at midnight. Give the sheriff the green light to ram the door." Outside in the freezing rain, a 30-ton bulldozer idled. Warren, a ruthless billionaire developer, was bleeding capital because one elderly woman refused to leave a condemned tenement. "No tactical breach," Warren ordered. "Armed men dragging a woman through the mud will panic the board. I'll place a $100,000 check on her table and neutralize this myself." He thought he was just clearing an obstacle for his skyscraper. He had no idea that buried inside her rotting apartment was the one debt his billions could never repay. He was about to discover his empire was built on a foundation that cost exactly $197.86. Before we see what he does next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. A 30-ton bulldozer idled in the freezing rain, vibrating the armored corporate SUV. Warren Evans sat in the back, staring coldly at the decaying 5-story tenement building. Warren was 48, the billionaire founder of Evans Commercial Development. For 2 hours, he had been losing capital due to apartment 4B. Warren felt no anger, only the friction of an unresolved logistical error. He had spent 14 years and $2.4 billion acquiring these blocks to build Apex Tower, an 80-story monolith. Every other tenant had been bought out, and every adjacent structure leveled, except this one building. A 70-year-old woman in apartment 4B had barricaded her steel door. She ignored eviction notices, severance packages, and threats of police removal, single-handedly paralyzing a multi-billion-dollar machine. Sitting next to Warren was Paul Larson, the chief operating officer and lead counsel. He was a ruthless man who viewed humans as numbers on a spreadsheet, reflecting Warren's own cold philosophy. Paul's face was lit by his tablet. "The demolition permit expires at 11:59 p.m., Warren," Paul stated flatly. "It is 11:15 p.m. If we don't breach by midnight, Commissioner Mitchell triggers a $50 million delay penalty and forces us to restart environmental surveys. That is a 6-month delay." "I am aware of the mathematics, Paul," Warren replied with quiet authority. "Then authorize the breach," Paul demanded. "Sheriff Greg Davis is in the lobby with a tactical unit. Give the green light. They ram the door, extract the trespasser, and we tear this pile down." Warren narrowed his eyes. Outside, the freezing rain turned the site into a sea of toxic mud. He saw Sheriff Davis waiting by his cruiser. Warren hated physical force because it was procedurally messy and generated terrible optics. "No tactical breach," Warren ordered. Paul stared in disbelief. "Warren, the federal court upheld eminent domain. She is a criminal trespasser violating an injunction. We owe her nothing." "We owe the board a clean transition," Warren corrected. "Armed men dragging an old woman out in the rain will leak to the press, panic the board, and drop our stock 3% by morning. That is an irrecoverable loss of $72 million. I won't authorize a $72 million mistake because you lack patience." "Negotiate?" Paul scoffed. "We mailed a $25,000 buyout. She mailed it back torn in half. She is irrational." "Everyone is rational when the correct equation is presented," Warren said. He extracted a platinum checkbook and a fountain pen from his bespoke suit. "Every human has a specific breaking point where sentimental attachment to a decaying room evaporates." Warren opened the door, stepping into the freezing mud. He had clawed his way out of deep poverty, surviving the foster system by never letting emotion cloud his judgment. He had zero tolerance for those who wallowed in the past. "Cut the bulldozer engine," Warren commanded. "Tell Sheriff Davis to stand down. I am going up to 4B. "The structure is condemned," Paul yelled. "There is toxic mold and severe structural degradation." "I am going to place a check for $100,000 on her table," Warren said, locking eyes with the top floor window. I will give her 5 minutes to take the money and walk out, or I unleash the sheriff. I am neutralizing this variable myself. Warren buttoned his overcoat and walked toward the building, completely unaware he was stepping into a museum of his own erased past. The interior of the condemned tenement building smelled exactly like the past Warren Evans had spent 30 years trying to incinerate. The air was heavy with the choking, stagnant stench of rot, waterlogged drywall, and active black mold. There was no electricity. The grand overhead light fixtures, which had once cast a warm glow over a bustling community decades ago, hung from the cracked plaster ceiling like dead, skeletal carcasses. Warren pressed the button on his high-powered tactical flashlight, cutting a clean, blinding beam of white light through the absolute darkness of the stairwell. As his expensive leather dress shoes stepped onto the first flight of stairs, the rotting wood groaned loudly beneath his weight. Warren didn't hesitate. He climbed with a steady, calculated pace, his posture perfectly upright beneath his heavy wool overcoat. He looked at the peeling green paint curling off the hallway walls like dead skin. To anyone else, this place was a tragic symbol of urban decay, a heartbreaking reminder of forgotten families. To Warren, it was just a completely inefficient use of prime municipal real estate. His internal monologue operated with the cold precision of a computer processing a spreadsheet. He despised buildings like this, not because they were ugly, but because they represented a systemic failure of discipline. He genuinely believed that poverty was a choice, a direct consequence of a weak mind and a lack of organizational structure. He had grown up in the absolute lowest depths of the state foster system, bouncing from one violent group home to another, sleeping on concrete floors, and eating expired cafeteria food. He had survived because he refused to wallow. He had won the game of capitalism by systematically cutting away every single emotional anchor, every memory, and every shred of nostalgia. To Warren, nostalgia was a fatal disease of the weak. He survived because he moved forward, and he looked at this crumbling structure as a tumor that needed to be surgically removed to make way for the clean, steel efficiency of Apex Tower. By the time Warren reached the landing of the third floor, his chest felt slightly tight from the toxic air, but his focus remained absolute. He swept his flashlight across the apartment doors. 3A was kicked in, revealing a hollow void of trash and discarded mattresses. 3B was boarded up with rough plywood. The building was completely hollowed out, a ghost ship waiting for the scrapyard. Suddenly, Warren paused. His flashlight beam swept over a low, built-in wooden shelving unit built into the hallway wall. It was covered in thick layers of gray dust and chunks of fallen plaster. Resting on the center shelf was a single, heavily faded manila folder. It looked entirely out of place, as if it had been placed there deliberately for someone to find. Warren stepped closer, his boots crunching on the grit. He tilted the flashlight beam down. Written across the tab of the folder in crisp, archival black ink was a name and a year. It read, Warren Evans, 1995. Warren stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. His fingers twitched inside his leather gloves. He stared at his own name, written in a hand he didn't recognize, buried in the dust of a condemned building he had never supposedly set foot in. A sharp, sudden spike of irritation hit him. He reached out to grab the folder, but his corporate mind instantly executed a defensive override. Evans was a common name. In a city of millions, there were thousands of Warren Evanses. It was a statistical coincidence, a meaningless glitch in the data. He was a billionaire dealing with a $50 million midnight deadline. He did not have time to audit a dusty piece of paper left behind by a stranger. He deliberately withdrew his hand, turning his back on the folder. He forced his mind back to the mathematics of the buyout. He checked his luxury wristwatch. It was 11:22 p.m. He had exactly 37 minutes left before his demolition permit expired, and he was currently wasting those minutes standing in a dark hallway. Warren turned the corner and faced the final flight of stairs leading to the top floor. He climbed faster, his jaw set, his heart rate elevated not from the physical exertion, but from the sudden, uncharacteristic friction in his mind. He reached the fourth-floor landing and stood directly in front of the heavy steel door of apartment 4B. A faint, golden thread of light was escaping from the threshold, cutting through the shadows at his feet. Warren raised his fist and struck the steel door 3 times, the heavy metallic echoes ringing out through the empty, rotting building. The heavy steel door didn't fly open with a panic-stricken screech. Instead, Warren heard the slow, heavy turn of a physical deadbolt, followed by the crisp snap of an iron latch. The door swung inward, and the stark, clinical beam of Warren's tactical flashlight was instantly met by the soft, warm glow of kerosene lamps. Warren stepped over the threshold into apartment 4B, and the visual contrast was jarring. His $10,000 bespoke charcoal suit, immaculate overcoat, and polished leather shoes looked completely alien against the buckling, water-damaged wooden floorboards of the rotting room. The apartment was freezing, the air thick with the smell of old paper, cold rain, and wax. Yet, there was no chaos here. Helen Brooks did not look like a desperate woman barricaded against a corporate empire. She was 70 years old, her posture calm, wearing a faded wool sweater. She wasn't holding a weapon, and she wasn't crying. She was standing next to a sturdy wooden table, completely occupied by a task. She was silently, methodically packing identical, perfectly labeled cardboard boxes. Warren's analytical eyes scanned the room, instantly looking for the clutter typical of tenants who refuse to move. But this wasn't clutter. The apartment was stripped bare, except for these boxes. And as Warren looked closer, he realized these weren't personal belongings. They were neatly organized files, stacks of old-school notebooks, official certificates, newspaper clippings, and thick manila envelopes, each one sorted by year and tied with heavy twine. It looked like an unofficial archive, a private museum of lives. Warren cleared his throat, his deep baritone cutting through the quiet crackle of the kerosene lamps. "Ms. Brooks," he said, keeping his voice entirely professional, clinical, and detached. "I am Warren Evans, CEO of Evans Commercial Development. I am sure you know exactly why I'm standing in your apartment at this hour." Helen didn't flinch at his voice. She didn't even stop her hands. She carefully placed a stack of old, yellowed index cards into a box, folded the cardboard flaps down, and sealed it with a long strip of heavy brown packing tape. Warren watched her, his irritation growing at her complete lack of urgency. He walked toward the center of the room, his boots making the floorboards groan. To him, this entire setup was an absurdity. Why risk physical removal by the sheriff for a collection of old paper? "You are single-handedly holding up a $2 billion project, Ms. Brooks," Warren continued, stepping toward the table. "Every hour those bulldozers down there sit idle, my company loses hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't care about the sentimentality of this room, and frankly, neither does the city. In exactly 35 minutes, your time is up." Helen finally stopped. She smoothed down the tape on the box with her thumb, turned around slowly, and looked at him. Her dark eyes were incredibly deep, filled with a calm, unshakable strength that Warren had rarely encountered in corporate boardrooms. She looked at his face, studying his sharp jawline, his cold eyes, and the rigid posture of his shoulders. She didn't look at his expensive clothes. She looked directly at him. There was a flicker of profound recognition in her eyes, but she kept her face entirely neutral. She was testing him. She wanted to see if the ruthless billionaire standing before her had completely hollowed out the boy she had once known. "I know exactly how much a minute of your time costs, Mr. Evans," Helen said softly, her voice steady and clear. "But the things in this room cannot be measured by your company's clock." Warren let out a short, dismissive breath. He walked closer to the table, his flashlight beam catching the edge of an open wooden drawer she had just emptied. On the very bottom of that drawer, covered by a clear plastic sleeve, lay an old, high-contrast black and white photograph. Warren's gaze locked onto it. It was a photograph of the front gates of St. Jude's Orphanage, the exact institutional foster facility where he had spent the bleakest years of his youth. Warren felt a sharp, sudden tightening in his chest. His fingers tensed inside his leather gloves. A wave of defensive anger hit his mind, but he instantly crushed it. It's just a coincidence. His internal logic slammed down. She was an old school teacher. She probably kept articles and photos of every municipal building in the district. He refused to let his past breach his armor. He looked away from the photograph, fixed his eyes on Helen, and reached into his coat for his checkbook. He was here to close a transaction, not to look at ghosts. Warren uncapped his heavy platinum fountain pen. The metallic click echoed sharply in the quiet, freezing room. He stepped directly to the wooden table, invading her personal space to establish absolute physical dominance. He flipped open his corporate checkbook, pressed it flat against a stack of worn manila folders, and began to write. His handwriting was sharp, jagged, and entirely unreadable, the signature of a man who authorized millions without a second thought. He tore the heavy watermarked paper from the binding and placed it face up in the center of the table, directly beneath the warm glow of the kerosene lamp. $100,000, Warren stated. His voice was a flat, weaponized instrument. Tax-free, cleared funds. You can walk into any bank branch tomorrow morning and withdraw it in cash. Helen stopped packing. She looked down at the piece of paper. To a woman living in a condemned apartment with no electricity, $100,000 was a lottery win. It was a completely life-altering sum. It was absolute salvation. Warren checked his heavy luxury wristwatch. "It is currently 11:28 p.m., he said, his tone perfectly procedural. "I am giving you exactly 5 minutes to accept this transaction. At 11:33 p.m., this offer permanently expires. I will tear the check in half. I will walk out of this room, and I will radio my chief operating officer to authorize the breach. Sheriff Davis and his tactical unit will break this door off its hinges, and they will forcibly drag you out into the freezing mud. You will leave with absolutely nothing." Warren took a half step back, crossing his arms over his expensive wool overcoat, waiting for the inevitable surrender. He had executed this exact psychological maneuver dozens of times. He knew human nature. Everyone had a price. The math never failed. Helen looked at the check for a long, silent moment. Then, with the calm, unbothered precision of a librarian, she reached out and pinched the edge of the paper. She didn't fold it. She didn't slip it into her pocket. She simply picked it up and moved it aside, placing it on the very edge of the table as if it were a useless piece of trash blocking her workspace. She went immediately back to packing her boxes. Warren's rigid posture faltered for a fraction of a second. His dark eyes widened slightly. A sudden, unfamiliar spike of genuine anger flared in his chest. The math had failed. It was completely illogical. No one ignored $100,000 in cash. "Did you not hear what I just said to you?" Warren demanded, his cold corporate Polish finally cracking to reveal the aggressive street survivalist underneath. Helen reached for the stack of files that the check had been resting on. "I heard you perfectly, Mr. Evans," she said quietly, her voice entirely devoid of fear. "But you cannot buy what is not for sale." As she lifted the stack of files, Warren's eyes darted down to the desk. The files she was moving were made of pale blue, thick cardstock. He recognized the exact shade of that paper. His breath hitched in his throat. They were administrative attendance ledgers from Lincoln Public High School. Warren's mind reeled. It was his high school, the exact underfunded public school he had attended in the mid-90s. As Helen's hands shifted the papers to place them in a box, Warren caught a clear, undeniable glimpse of a date stamped in faded red ink on the top right corner of the visible ledger. It read, November 1996. The exact month and year of his senior scholarship interview, the month that had defined his entire existence and allowed him to escape the poverty of his youth. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The dusty folder in the hallway, the black and white photo of the St. Jude's orphanage, and now the exact administrative records of his specific high school from the exact month his life changed forever. The statistical probability of this being a random coincidence was rapidly dropping to absolute zero. Warren's heart pounded against his ribs. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate stress. It was the primal panic of a man whose perfectly constructed reality was beginning to fracture from the inside out. Suddenly, the two-way radio clipped to Warren's belt erupted with harsh, crackling static. "Warren, copy!" Paul Larson's voice barked sharply from the speaker, shattering the heavy silence of the apartment. "It is 11:30 p.m. Commissioner Mitchell has the emergency obstruction penalty in his hand. You have exactly 29 minutes before he signs it. Give me the green light for the sheriff." Warren stared at the pale blue high school ledger. He stared at the 70-year-old woman, meticulously tying a knot of heavy twine around a cardboard box. He had to shut this down. He had to clear this room and bury these boxes under 30 tons of rubble before his entire self-made illusion collapsed. Warren pressed his thumb against the volume dial of his radio, aggressively clicking it off. The harsh static died instantly, leaving only the sound of the freezing winter rain battering the cracked glass of the window pane. He took a slow, controlled breath, forcing his elevated heart rate back down to a steady, operational rhythm. He absolutely refused to let a pile of old paper destabilize him. He stepped closer to the wooden table, his physical presence looming over the smaller woman. He pointed a rigid, leather-gloved finger at the cardboard boxes stacked against the rotting drywall. "Look at this," Warren said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "Look at what you are actively protecting. You are risking physical assault by a tactical police unit. You are throwing away $100,000 in cleared cash. For what? For water-damaged cardboard. For old ink that means absolutely nothing to the outside world." Helen reached for a bundle of letters tied with a faded green ribbon. She gently placed them into the next box. "They mean something to the people who wrote them," she replied quietly. "They are anchors," Warren snapped, his corporate mask slipping just enough to reveal the raw, aggressive street survivor underneath. This was his core philosophy, bleeding out into the freezing room. Nostalgia is a massive financial liability. It is a luxury reserved solely for people who do not have the discipline to move forward. You hold on to the past because you are terrified of the future. But the past is gone, Ms. Brooks. It is dead. And everything in this room is dead weight. Helen stopped moving. She didn't reach for the next file. She didn't fold the next cardboard flap. She slowly turned her head and looked directly into Warren's eyes. The flickering kerosene light caught the deep, ancient resilience in her face. She wasn't looking at a billionaire CEO. She was looking right through the $10,000 suit, right through the polished armor, straight into the terrified 17-year-old boy he had buried 30 years ago. "Funny," Helen said. Her voice was incredibly soft, but it hit the silent room like a physical shockwave. "That is exactly what people said about you when you were 17. Warren physically recoiled. His right shoulder jerked back a fraction of an inch, an involuntary flinch he couldn't suppress. A cold spike of pure adrenaline shot straight through his nervous system. How could she possibly know that? His analytical mind scrambled, desperately trying to protect his fabricated reality. "Public relations," his brain screamed. She read the corporate PR profiles. Over the years, financial magazines had written dozens of articles about his spectacular rise from the state foster system to the Forbes list. The narrative of the troubled, unwanted orphan was public knowledge. She was just weaponizing his own public biography against him to gain psychological leverage in the negotiation. Yes, That was the only logical explanation. Warren immediately hardened his posture, locking his spine and raising his chin. "My biography is a matter of public record," he stated coldly. "Do not attempt to use cheap psychological tactics to manipulate this transaction. It will not work on me. I am not the weak boy they wrote about in those magazines." Helen's expression didn't change. She didn't offer a triumphant smirk. She just looked at him with a profound, unbearable sadness. She reached out and gently rested her hand on top of the sealed box containing the blue high school ledgers. "You have been in this room before, Warren," she said quietly. Warren let out a harsh, dismissive breath, shaking his head. He immediately defaulted to the cold, legal realities of the property. "My legal team executed a comprehensive 40-year title search on this entire city block," he countered, his voice entirely clinical. "I know every previous owner, every municipal lien, and every structural fault. I have never once set foot in this decaying building before tonight." "I didn't say you had been in this building," Helen replied, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "I said you have been in this room." Warren stared at her. The statement was a complete logistical paradox. It made absolutely no sense, but the absolute, unwavering certainty in her voice made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The oppressive, freezing air of the apartment suddenly felt incredibly heavy, pressing painfully against his ribs. He looked down at the table. He looked at the old photographs, the blue high school ledgers, the meticulously labeled files of saved children. The psychological pressure in the room was becoming intolerable. This space wasn't just a physical obstacle anymore. It was an active, breathing threat to his sanity. He needed to accelerate the timeline. He needed to clear this table, force her out the door, and let the bulldozers bury this nightmare forever. The heavy, suffocating silence of the room was violently shattered by the radio clipped to Warren's belt. He hadn't turned the device completely off. He had only dialed the volume down. Now, Paul Larson's voice cut through the static, completely stripped of its usual measured corporate polish. Paul was openly panicking. "Warren, respond immediately," Paul's voice snapped from the small black speaker, the urgency bleeding into the freezing air. "It is 11:43 p.m. We are exactly 17 minutes away from a total operational failure. Commissioner Mitchell is standing next to my vehicle right now. He literally has the emergency obstruction penalty in his hand. If we do not have visual confirmation of a breach by midnight, he signs it. $50 million, Warren." Warren did not take his eyes off the 70-year-old woman standing across the table. "Furthermore," Paul continued, the radio hissing with the sound of the freezing rain outside, "Sheriff Davis has just informed me that his tactical extraction unit is moving from the lobby to the third-floor stairwell. In exactly 10 minutes, at 11:53 p.m., he is legally authorized to initiate the tactical breach protocol. He will not wait for your permission, Warren. They are going to hit that door with a solid steel ram. You need to clear the blast radius right now." The radio clicked dead. The external timer was no longer a theoretical corporate threat. It was a physical reality marching up the rotting stairs. 10 minutes until heavily armed men stormed the room. 17 minutes until his company lost $50 million and a minimum of 6 months of developmental progress. Warren's jaw tightened until the muscles ached. The terrifying, impossible puzzle of this room, the orphanage photo, the high school ledgers, the cryptic, haunting statements, was actively sabotaging his focus. He was letting a pile of dusty paper compromise a $2 billion skyscraper. He needed to crush this anomaly immediately. "The timeline is no longer negotiable, Ms. Brooks," Warren commanded, his deep voice dropping into a harsh, authoritarian register. He reached into his overcoat pocket and pulled out a single sheet of folded corporate letterhead, a standard voluntary vacate waiver. He slammed it down onto the wooden table next to the $100,000 check. "Sign this waiver," Warren ordered. "Take the check. Walk out of this building before the police drag you out in handcuffs. I am ending this transaction right now." He needed a pen. His own platinum fountain pen was still resting on the far edge of the table. Warren's eyes darted across her workspace and locked onto a heavy, brass ink pen resting on top of a stack of sealed envelopes. He reached out and aggressively grabbed the brass pen. As he yanked it upward, the top envelope stuck to the metal barrel for a fraction of a second before dropping back onto the table, landing face up directly under the harsh glare of his flashlight. Warren looked down to ensure he hadn't knocked a glass over. His eyes caught the return address written on the yellowed postal envelope. His breathing instantly stopped. The address was written in thick black archival ink. But it wasn't the ink that paralyzed him. It was the handwriting. It was a highly distinct, meticulous cursive script. The letters featured a sharp, aggressive rightward slant, with perfectly measured, razor-thin loops on the lowercase letters. It was a flawless, almost mechanical calligraphy that was entirely unique. Warren stared at the envelope, his heart hammering a violent rhythm against his ribs. He knew that exact handwriting. It was permanently burned into the deepest, darkest vault of his memory. 30 years ago, when he was a desperate, impoverished 17-year-old orphan applying for the single college scholarship that would ultimately save his life, he couldn't afford to hire a typist. He hadn't even owned a functioning pen. A woman, a nameless teacher whose memory he had deliberately suppressed to maintain his self-made narrative, had sat down with him in a drafty school cafeteria and filled out the massive 20-page application by hand. The handwriting on his college scholarship application was an exact, flawless match to the handwriting on the envelope currently sitting on the rotting table. The cognitive dissonance was catastrophic. The mathematical probability of this specific woman possessing that specific handwriting, alongside the St. Jude's orphanage photo and the Lincoln High School ledgers, defied all logic. His fabricated reality was actively collapsing around him. A sudden massive surge of defensive anger erupted in Warren's chest. The fear of losing his identity transformed instantly into raw aggression. He wasn't going to let a ghost from his past destroy the empire he had built. "Sign the paper!" Warren shouted, his voice echoing violently off the peeling walls, entirely losing his corporate control. He shoved the brass pen toward her across the table. "You have exactly 9 minutes before they break that door down. Sign it." The echo of Warren's shout slammed against the rotting drywall and faded into the steady, freezing rhythm of the rain outside. He stood towering over the small wooden table, his chest heaving, the brass pen held out like a weapon. He had completely lost his corporate polish. The billionaire CEO was gone, replaced entirely by a desperate, cornered man watching his meticulously constructed reality fracture before his eyes. Helen Brooks did not flinch. She did not reach for the pen. She did not look at the $100,000 check or the voluntary vacate waiver. She simply looked at Warren's trembling hand, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering golden light of the kerosene lamp. "I cannot sign a waiver for a building I do not own, Mr. Evans," Helen said, her voice retaining that impossible, infuriating calm. "The city owns the bricks. I only own what is inside these boxes, and I am packing them as fast as my hands will allow." Warren checked his luxury wristwatch. It was 11:45 p.m. He had exactly 8 minutes before Sheriff Davis and his heavily armed tactical extraction unit breached the third-floor stairwell and hit the steel door of apartment 4B with a battering ram. He had 14 minutes before Commissioner Mitchell signed the obstruction penalty, permanently wiping $50 million from his corporate ledger. Words had failed, money had failed, logic had failed. "Then we are going to accelerate your timeline," Warren stated, his voice dropping into a lethal, mechanical cadence. He stepped aggressively around the wooden table, fully invading her physical workspace. If she wouldn't leave voluntarily, he was going to force her out by destroying the anchors keeping her here. He was going to perform a ruthless manual audit of her life. "You are operating with extreme inefficiency," Warren snapped, pointing his tactical flashlight at a stack of loose, yellowing newspapers in the corner. "That is trash. You leave it? He shifted the beam to a pile of folded, moth-eaten blankets. Trash, dead weight, it stays. He stepped toward the center of the room, his expensive leather boots crushing the dust and debris. He reached out and grabbed a thick, heavy stack of old, spiral-bound school notebooks resting on top of an open crate. "This is completely irrelevant," Warren declared, lifting the heavy notebooks to toss them onto the discard pile. But as the stark white beam of his flashlight swept across the top notebook, the light caught a dark, circular coffee stain on the faded cardboard cover. Right beneath that stain, written in cheap, smudge blue ballpoint ink, was a name. Warren's breathing violently stopped, his lungs locked. The name written on the notebook was Warren Cole. It was his childhood name, the surname he was given by the state foster system before he legally changed it to Evans to completely sever himself from the poverty, the abuse, and the absolute humiliation of his past. No one in the corporate world knew the name Cole. It had been buried beneath a $2 billion empire, permanently erased from public records by expensive lawyers decades ago. Warren stared at his own teenage handwriting. The blue ink seemed to burn through his leather gloves. A sudden, terrifying phantom smell filled his nostrils, the sharp chemical scent of the St. Jude's orphanage cafeteria cleaner. His brain violently stuttered. The cognitive firewall he had spent 30 years building was actively crashing. "It is a statistical coincidence," his mind screamed desperately, flooding his system with defensive adrenaline. Warren is a common name. Cole is a common name. She was a public school teacher. She had thousands of students. He refused to let the lie die. If he admitted the truth, he was not self-made. If he was not self-made, he was nothing. "Trash!" Warren choked out, his deep voice suddenly hoarse and shaking. He violently threw the stack of spiral notebooks onto the rotting floorboards, severing the physical connection to the memory. He immediately pivoted, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperate to find a target to reestablish his control. He locked onto a massive, heavy cardboard box sitting at the very bottom of the primary stack. It was the foundational box. It was heavily wrapped in thick layers of old, yellowed packing tape, clearly protecting the deepest, oldest files in her archive. Warren lunged toward it. He grabbed the thick edge of the cardboard, his leather gloves gripping the tape. "This," Warren declared, his eyes completely wild as he prepared to rip the heavy box away from the wall. "This is trash." Helen stepped quickly across the floorboards, placing her small frame directly between the Billionaire and the stack of boxes. "Don't touch that," Helen said, her voice finally losing its calm, replaced by a sharp, protective command. But Warren was out of time. Warren's leather-gloved hands tightened around the thick taped edges of the heavy foundational box. The rotting floorboards groaned under his weight as he braced his expensive boots, preparing to violently drag the cardboard away from the peeling drywall. Helen Brooks stood directly in front of him. She did not physically strike him, but she placed her small, calloused hands firmly over his. "Don't touch that," she repeated. Her voice was no longer the calm, detached tone of a librarian. It was the fierce, desperate command of a protector. Before Warren could respond, the two-way radio clipped to his belt violently erupted with a burst of static. "Warren, your timeline is 0, Paul Larson's voice barked, the panic now fully replaced by cold operational execution. "It is 11:50 p.m. Sheriff Davis has bypassed the lobby. His tactical extraction unit has just breached the third-floor stairwell. They are ascending to the fourth floor right now with a steel battering ram. Clear the blast radius immediately." The heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots pounding against the wooden stairs echoed through the decaying walls. They were coming. In less than 3 minutes, heavily armed men were going to smash the steel door off its hinges. Warren's mind snapped. The sophisticated corporate billionaire completely vanished, leaving only a desperate man trying to maintain control over a terrifying, collapsing reality. He had to sever her connection to this room. If he destroyed the archive, the anchor would break, and she would leave. "I am saving your life," Warren roared, his deep voice echoing violently over the approaching footsteps. He completely ignored her plea. He didn't push her, but he used his overwhelming physical size to leverage his weight backward, aggressively yanking the heavy cardboard box toward the center of the room. He expected the box to slide. He expected her to step back in defeat. But the mathematics of the physical world failed him one final time. The massive box was over 30 years old. The cardboard had been soaking in the freezing, damp air of the condemned building for months. It was structurally compromised, severely water-damaged, and packed far beyond its maximum weight capacity. As Warren yanked the box backward with all of his strength, the thick layers of yellowed packing tape held, but the cardboard itself suffered a catastrophic structural failure. With a loud, violent rip that sounded like a gunshot in the freezing room, the entire front panel of the box tore open from top to bottom. Warren stumbled backward, losing his balance as the heavy box violently collapsed in his hands. A massive, unstoppable avalanche of paper erupted from the ruptured cardboard. Hundreds of documents, letters, sealed envelopes, and photographs cascaded onto the buckling, rotting floorboards, burying Warren's $10,000 leather boots in a sea of forgotten memories. The archive had breached. Warren dropped to his knees in the freezing dirt and debris. He was completely blinded by adrenaline and extreme corporate irritation. He didn't care about the history scattered on the floor. He just needed to clear the path. "Look at what you were doing!" Warren shouted, his chest heaving as he pointed his high-powered tactical flashlight down at the mess. He aggressively reached out with both hands, attempting to violently shove the massive pile of papers back together like a pile of dead leaves. "Leave them," Helen whispered, her voice trembling for the very first time. She dropped to her knees on the other side of the pile, desperately trying to protect the fragile documents from his crushing grip. But Warren didn't stop. He grabbed a thick handful of papers, preparing to throw them aside. As his leather glove closed around the stack, the harsh white beam of his tactical flashlight illuminated the very bottom of the pile. Warren's hand froze midair. His breathing completely stopped. The violent, rhythmic pounding of the tactical police unit, storming up the stairwell, faded into absolute, deafening silence. The freezing rain lashing against the cracked windows ceased to exist. Lying perfectly flat against the rotting floorboards, completely isolated from the rest of the scattered documents, was a single, faded Polaroid photograph. And stapled to the top left corner of that photograph was a small, yellowed, heavily creased piece of thermal receipt paper from a thrift store. Warren stared at the image, the psychological defense he had spent 3 decades building to protect his self-made identity permanently broke. The beam of the tactical flashlight trembled. For the very first time in his adult life, Warren Evans's hand was shaking. He remained on his knees in the freezing dirt and debris of apartment 4B. The deafening, rhythmic sounds of the tactical police unit storming up the stairwell were completely muted by the roaring rush of blood pounding in his ears. His eyes were locked onto the faded Polaroid photograph resting on the rotting floorboards. The revelation did not hit him instantly. It was a slow, agonizing, physical breakdown, unfolding piece by piece in the harsh white light. First, he saw the suit in the picture. It was a cheap, ugly brown wool suit. The jacket was far too large, the heavy fabric completely swallowing the frail shoulders of the boy wearing it. The collar was slightly frayed, and the cheap polyester tie was knotted crookedly. Next, his eyes moved down to the shoes in the photograph. They were cheap synthetic leather, but they were polished so aggressively they actually looked wet under the camera flash. Warren knew those shoes. A phantom ache shot through his fingers. He had polished those exact shoes with coarse paper napkins and liquid hand soap in the filthy bathroom of the St. Jude's orphanage exactly 30 years ago. Warren stopped breathing. The freezing, moldy air of the condemned apartment completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a sharp, violent sensory memory. He smelled the heavy scent of mothballs, cheap industrial carpet cleaner, and wet snow melting on linoleum. He looked at the face of the boy in the photograph. The boy was too thin, his cheekbones sharp from institutional malnutrition. His eyes were wide, terrified, yet burning with a desperate animalistic need to escape his reality. It was him. It was 17-year-old Warren Cole. Warren's gloved fingers reached out. They hovered over the photograph, terrified to touch it, terrified to make it real. He looked at the small, yellowed piece of thrift store receipt paper, stapled carefully to the top left corner of the Polaroid. The thermal ink had severely faded over 3 decades, but the final sum printed at the bottom was perfectly, undeniably legible. Total, $197.86. Warren reached down and slowly turned the photograph over. On the back, written in that same flawless, aggressive cursive script with the razor-thin loops, was a single sentence. For Warren, interview day. The words hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The psychological fortress he had spent a lifetime building, the arrogant, impenetrable belief that he was a self-made titan who owed the world absolutely nothing, violently collapsed into dust. He had not climbed out of poverty alone. He had not survived the foster system through pure, solitary discipline. He was carried. Warren slowly lifted his head. He looked across the scattered sea of documents at the 70-year-old woman kneeling on the floorboards opposite him. He looked past the wrinkles, past the gray hair, past the faded wool sweater. He saw the young, quiet high school teacher who had noticed a starving, desperate foster kid sitting in a drafty hallway, terrified of an upcoming college scholarship interview because he didn't own a single piece of professional clothing. He remembered the wet snow. He remembered her walking him silently down the street to the thrift store. He remembered her pulling her own worn leather wallet from her purse to pay for the brown suit, the crooked tie, and the bus ticket. He had never asked her how much it cost. He had never looked back after he won the scholarship. He had simply walked into his new life and deliberately erased her from his memory. Warren stared at the receipt in his trembling hand. His massive 80-story apex tower was currently valued at $2.4 billion, but its foundation had cost exactly $197.86. "It was you," Warren whispered. The deep, commanding baritone of the Billionaire CEO was completely gone. His voice broke, sounding exactly like the terrified 17-year-old orphan in the photograph. "You bought the suit." Helen Brooks knelt in the freezing debris, her dark eyes filled with the exact same quiet grace she had possessed 30 years ago. She didn't ask for a thank you. She didn't point out his hypocrisy. Before she could speak, the heavy steel door of apartment 4B shuddered violently. A deafening metallic crash echoed through the room as Sheriff Davis's tactical team slammed a solid steel battering ram into the deadbolt. The wood frame splintered. The physical world had arrived to destroy the room. The massive steel door of apartment 4B buckled inward with a deafening shriek of tearing metal. The tactical battering ram struck a second time, violently shaking the rotting floorboards beneath Warren's knees. Dust and fractured plaster rained down from the ceiling, coating the scattered documents in a layer of gray grit. But Warren Evans didn't move. He didn't blink. The deafening violence of the present moment was entirely drowned out by a memory he had spent 30 years burying alive. He was no longer a billionaire CEO kneeling in a condemned building. He was 17 years old again, standing in the freezing, drafty hallway of Lincoln Public High School. It was November 1996. He remembered the exact feeling of the rough cinder block wall against his back. He was holding the final confirmation letter for a statewide academic scholarship interview. It was his only ticket out of the St. Jude's orphanage. But he wasn't going to go. The director of the foster facility had taken one look at Warren's frayed jeans, his worn-out sneakers, and his threadbare jacket, and told him to skip the interview. The director had explicitly told him not to embarrass the state. Warren had stood in that high school hallway, entirely crushed by the absolute mathematical certainty that his poverty was a permanent, inescapable prison. Then, he heard the quiet click of sensible heels on the linoleum. A young history teacher named Ms. Brooks had walked up to him. She didn't offer him pity. She didn't offer him useless, sentimental words of encouragement. She simply looked at the interview letter in his shaking hand, looked at his worn-out sneakers, and said 2 words: "Get up." Warren remembered walking silently beside her through 3 blocks of freezing wet snow. They entered a dimly lit thrift store smelling of mothballs and dust. He remembered the humiliating weight of putting on that cheap, oversized brown suit. He remembered standing frozen at the cash register, watching her pull her worn leather wallet from her purse. The cashier had rung up the suit, the synthetic leather shoes, and a cheap tie. The green digital display read exactly $197.86. Warren remembered staring at the cash in her hand. It was an astronomical amount of money for a public school teacher in 1996. He had looked up at her, terrified of the debt, terrified of the vulnerability. He had asked her why she was doing this for a state kid she barely knew. "Because the world only needs one person to bet on you, Warren," she had said quietly, handing the bills to the cashier. "Before you learn to bet on yourself." Kneeling in the debris of apartment 4, be 30 years later, the billionaire's analytical mind ruthlessly processed the data. The mathematical equation he had ignored his entire life finally balanced itself in his head. He knew the exact macroeconomic data of the mid-90s. He knew exactly what a junior public school teacher earned in that district. $197 was not her spare change. It was her rent money. Warren stared at the faded receipt stapled to the photograph. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had taken her money, won the scholarship, and climbed his way to the absolute top of the corporate world, proudly and aggressively erasing her from his narrative. And because of that exact purchase, because she had bought his future, Helen Brooks had missed her rent. She had been evicted. She had paid the ultimate price for his success, and he had spent 3 decades aggressively trying to tear down the very buildings she was forced to live in. A third, massive strike from the battering ram hit the door. The top steel hinge violently sheared off the door frame, sending a shower of sparks and rusted iron splinters into the freezing room. "Breach point compromised!" a tactical officer roared from the hallway. "Going in!" The memory violently evaporated. The tactical unit was seconds away from storming the room, ready to throw the woman who had built him out into the freezing mud. Warren's corporate armor was permanently destroyed. His eyes snapped up from the photograph, blazing with a terrifying, primal urgency. He dropped the receipt, grabbed the 2-way radio from his belt, and scrambled to his feet. The heavy steel door finally gave way. The bottom hinge violently sheared off the frame, and the massive door slammed onto the floorboards with a deafening crash, kicking up a blinding cloud of toxic gray dust. 4 heavily armed tactical officers from the sheriff's department swarmed into the freezing apartment, their assault rifles raised, the blinding white beams of their weapon-mounted flashlights cutting through the kerosene glow. "Hands where we can see them! Move! Move!" the lead officer screamed. He was entirely prepared to cross the room and physically tackle the 70-year-old woman into the dirt. They never reached her. Warren Evans stepped directly into the fatal funnel of the doorway. He placed his massive frame squarely between the armed tactical unit and Helen Brooks. He didn't raise his hands in surrender. He stood with the absolute, terrifying authority of a man who owned the city block, the politicians, and the very ground the officers were standing on. "Stand down immediately," Warren commanded. His deep baritone did not shake. It cut through the chaos like a physical blade. The lead officer froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. He was completely disoriented by the sight of the billionaire CEO actively shielding the trespasser. "Mr. Evans, we have the green light for extraction." You need to clear the room." "I said stand down," Warren repeated, his voice dropping to a lethal, non-negotiable register. "Lower your weapons, step out of this apartment, and wait in the stairwell. That is a direct operational order." The officers exchanged confused, tense glances, but the sheer gravity of Warren's presence forced their compliance. They slowly lowered their rifles and backed out into the dark hallway. Warren didn't wait for them to leave. He reached down, unclipped the two-way radio from his belt, and pressed the transmission button. "Larson, report." The radio crackled instantly. Paul Larson's voice was frantic, the heavy rhythmic thrum of idling bulldozer engines roaring in the background. "Warren, we heard the breach. The door is down. The structural perimeter is clear. It is 11:57 p.m. We have exactly 2 minutes. Give the bulldozer operator the green light to hit the load-bearing wall, or Commissioner Mitchell signs the penalty." Warren looked down at the floorboards. He looked at the scattered files, the faded blue high school ledgers, and the Polaroid photograph of the terrified 17-year-old boy. He looked at Helen, who was still kneeling in the freezing dirt, her small hands resting gently over a stack of saved letters. For 30 years, Warren had believed that capital was the only true power in the world. He was about to prove himself wrong. "Cut the engines," Warren said into the radio. Dead silence echoed over the frequency. "Repeat, Warren," Paul's voice came back, confused and sharp. "The wind is distorting the signal. Confirm the green light for demolition." "There is no green light, Paul," Warren stated. His voice was completely calm, entirely devoid of the cold corporate anxiety that had driven him all night. "Shut down the bulldozers, call off the demolition team, withdraw the sheriff's deputies from the perimeter. We are not tearing this building down tonight. We are not tearing it down tomorrow." "Warren, have you lost your mind?" Paul screamed over the radio, his pristine corporate polish completely shattering. "Commissioner Mitchell is standing right next to my vehicle. He has the pen on the paper. It is 11:58 p.m. If you do not authorize this strike in 60 seconds, we lose $50 million in municipal fines." "Then let him sign it," Warren replied coldly. "You are throwing away $50 million, Paul yelled, genuine panic bleeding into his voice. "You are completely compromising a $2.4 billion project over a pile of trash." "I am paying a debt, Paul," Warren said quietly, looking directly into Helen's dark eyes. "A debt that is 30 years overdue. Tell Mitchell to sign the paper. Tell the board of directors I personally authorized the penalty. This site is permanently locked down." Warren took his thumb off the transmission button. He aggressively twisted the volume dial to 0, completely severing his connection to the outside world. Down on the street, 300 feet below, the massive diesel engines of the 30-ton bulldozers slowly sputtered and died. The violent mechanical vibrations that had been shaking the rotting floorboards completely ceased. The external timer was officially dead. Warren had willingly absorbed a catastrophic financial blow to protect the room. He turned to Helen, preparing to speak, preparing to finally bridge the 30-year gap between the orphan and the billionaire. But the silence on the street didn't mean surrender. Down in the mud, Paul Larson was not a man who accepted defeat. Paul was the exact, ruthless corporate monster Warren had trained him to be. And a ruthless corporate monster does not let a CEO throw away $50 million without executing a hostile corporate override. The silence in the freezing apartment lasted exactly 15 seconds. Warren Evans knelt on the rotting floorboards, staring at the woman who had bought his future, preparing to speak. But the quiet was suddenly shattered by a harsh, aggressive burst of static. It didn't come from Warren's radio. It came from the shoulder-mounted radio of the tactical police officer standing out in the hallway. "Sheriff Davis to Tactical Unit 1, the radio barked, the voice tense and urgent. "We have a severe operational shift." Warren stood up slowly, his dark eyes narrowing. He brushed the gray dust off his $10,000 overcoat and walked toward the shattered doorway. "Officer, I gave you a direct, unshakable order to stand down and clear this stairwell. The lead officer didn't look at Warren. He kept his gloved hand pressed tightly to his earpiece, his face tightening as he listened to the secure frequency. "Copy that, Sheriff. Awaiting confirmation." The officer lowered his hand and looked directly at the billionaire. His posture had completely changed. The deferential respect for the CEO was entirely gone. "Mr. Evans," the officer said, his voice dropping to a flat, professional tone, "we just received a direct order from the county magistrate, backed by an emergency affidavit from your chief operating officer. Mr. Larson has submitted medical and hazardous materials, reports proving this structure has severe, toxic black mold saturation. Under state health safety codes, you are currently compromised and legally classified as being an immediate physical danger. We are not arresting you, sir. We are executing an emergency medical extraction for your own safety. Take the woman, clear the room. We have been ordered to extract the trespasser, and we have been explicitly ordered to physically remove you from the premises for your own medical safety." "You take one step into this room," Warren said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register, "and I will personally ensure that every single officer in this unit spends the rest of their careers directing traffic in the absolute worst district of this city. I will bankrupt your department with litigation." "You can take that up with your COO tomorrow morning," the officer said. He unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his Kevlar vest. "It is 11:58 p.m. The bulldozers are moving in. Take Mr. Evans into protective custody. Grab the woman." The three officers behind him raised their polycarbonate riot shields and surged forward, violently pushing into the freezing apartment. For the first time in his entire life, Warren Evans did not use a pen, a checkbook, or a legal threat to solve a problem. He used his hands. The three officers stepped into the room, their heavy boots crunching on the scattered papers. They didn't draw weapons. This wasn't a raid on a cartel. It was a civil extraction. The lead officer reached for Helen's arm. Warren didn't throw a punch. He didn't fight. Instead, he simply stepped into the gap, placing his massive frame directly between the officer's hand and the elderly woman. He locked his knees, dropped his center of gravity, and let the officer slam into his chest. "Touch her, and the footage from my vehicle's dash cam goes directly to the federal prosecutor before we leave the city block," Warren whispered, his voice deadly quiet. "You execute a medical extraction on me, officer, and I will fund a civil rights lawsuit against your department that will strip your shield by morning. Step back." But it was three heavily armed men against one unarmed civilian. The officers surged forward, using the flat face of their polycarbonate shields to forcefully shove Warren out of the fatal funnel. Warren's breath left his lungs in a sharp hiss as he was pushed back, dropping to one knee on the rotting floorboards. Behind Warren, Helen looked at his rigid shoulders, then down at the check and the voluntary vacate waiver resting on the edge of the table. She saw the police. She saw the cold determination in Warren's eyes, and she understood the absolute ruin Paul Larson was about to bring down on him. Before the officers could push past Warren, Helen calmly stepped forward. She didn't look at the check. She picked up the heavy brass pen, pressed the corporate letterhead flat against the wood, and with a swift, elegant motion, slashed her signature across the bottom. She slid the paper across the table toward Warren. "It's done, Warren," she said softly, her dark eyes steady. "The bricks belong to them. They always did. Don't destroy your life trying to save what's already gone." At that exact moment, a heavy mechanical shutter ripped through the floorboards. Outside, the second demolition crew, operating on the original midnight schedule and cut off from the radio chaos, struck the adjacent structural wall of the building's eastern wing. The century-old foundation groaned under the sudden kinetic impact. The glass in the window pane violently shattered inward, spraying sharp crystals into the dark. A massive chunk of the plaster ceiling detached, crashing heavily onto the packing table and splintering the wooden legs. A thick, suffocating cloud of dust instantly filled the room, blinding everyone. "Structure's unstable! Fall back to the stairwell!" the lead officer yelled, operational safety overriding the extraction order. The police retreated instantly, coughing through the dust. Warren couldn't see, but he didn't need to. He moved purely on the muscle memory of a desperate street kid. He lunged across the buckling floorboards toward the center of the room. He didn't reach for the scattered archive. He didn't reach for the faded Polaroid photograph or the thermal receipt that proved his entire empire was built on a teacher's charity. The past was already dead. He reached for the only thing in the room that actually mattered. He grabbed Helen Brooks. She had been thrown to the floor when the officer abandoned her. Warren's massive, leather-gloved hands grabbed the thick wool of her sweater. He hauled the 70-year-old woman off the splintering wood, pulling her tight against his expensive dust-covered overcoat to shield her from the falling debris. "Hold on to me!" Warren roared over the catastrophic noise of the collapsing building. As he pulled her up, his eyes darted to the wooden table. The plaster had missed one corner. Resting on the very edge, illuminated by a single rolling tactical flashlight dropped by the fleeing police, was the corporate voluntary vacate waiver. At the absolute bottom of the page, violently slashed in heavy brass ink, was Helen's signature. In the corporate world, that piece of paper was an absolute legally binding contract. It meant Helen had officially vacated the premises voluntarily. It meant the municipal delay penalty was null and void. And most importantly, it meant Paul Larson's emergency executive override was based on a completely fraudulent premise. Warren snatched the paper from the table, crumpling it into his fist as he wrapped his other arm tightly around Helen. "Move!" Warren shouted. They sprinted for the shattered doorway. Behind them, the structural failure of the eastern wing violently tore through apartment 4B. The floorboards buckled, swallowing the wooden table and the archive into a cloud of crushing debris. Warren and Helen hit the stairwell. The building groaned under their feet, but the core concrete steps held. They half ran, half fell down the dark flights of stairs, entirely blinded by plaster dust. They reached the ground floor lobby and shoved the heavy doors open, stumbling out into the freezing mud. Behind them, the eastern half of the tenement building lay in ruins. The apartment they had just stood in was gone, sheared off and exposed to the freezing rain. The deafening roar of the localized collapse slowly faded, replaced by the hissing of the storm and the mechanical rumble of the idling bulldozer. Warren slowly got to his feet. His $10,000 suit was ruined. His ribs were bruised. His empire was fractured. But his mind had never been clearer. He looked through the freezing rain and saw Paul Larson stepping out of the armored corporate SUV, a look of absolute arrogant triumph on his face. Paul thought he had won. He thought he had buried the problem, but he had absolutely no idea what Warren was holding in his fist. The freezing winter rain washed the toxic gray dust from Warren Evans's ruined $10,000 suit as he stood up in the mud. Beside him, Helen Brooks sat on the steel bumper of an abandoned construction truck, coughing quietly but alive. Behind them, the ruins of apartment 4B smoked in the cold air, a 3-story grave of crushed bricks and shattered timber. Paul Larson walked toward them across the construction site. He was flanked by Sheriff Davis and 2 paramedics. Paul didn't look relieved to see his boss alive. He looked profoundly irritated that Warren had survived the collapse. "Get a medical transport for Mr. Evans," Paul ordered the paramedics, his voice dripping with false corporate concern. "He is suffering from severe psychological trauma and shock. The executive incapacitation order remains in full effect." Paul stopped 10 feet away from Warren, stepping carefully to avoid getting mud on his immaculate leather shoes. He looked at the smoking rubble, then at the billionaire. "It didn't have to be this messy, Warren," Paul said smoothly, adjusting his silk tie. "If you had simply maintained your operational discipline, we could have avoided this public spectacle. But you broke. You let sentimentality compromise a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. I had to step in and save the company from your emotional failure." Warren did not scream. He didn't lunge at his former protege. He simply stared at Paul with the cold, lethal calculation that had built his empire. "You didn't save the company, Paul," Warren said. His deep baritone was completely steady, cutting through the howling wind. "You just committed corporate suicide." Paul Larson stood by the corporate SUV, watching Warren and Helen emerge into the freezing rain, covered in plaster dust. His face was expressionless, his legal mind already calculating the damage. "You're done, Warren," Paul said smoothly, adjusting his coat. "The waiver is signed, but you broke protocol. The board will vote for your removal by 9 a.m. Warren didn't look at his ruined suit. He held up the signed paper. "The waiver was executed at 11:59 p.m. Your crew struck the adjacent wing at exactly midnight, while a civil extraction was still active and 5 people were inside the structure. That is a gross violation of federal safety regulations, criminal endangerment, and a direct breach of our insurance covenants. The board won't fire me, Paul. They will settle with me to keep the federal government from freezing our assets. You signed the demolition order. You are fired, Paul. And by morning, the State Bar Association will receive the full log of your transmissions." Warren turned his back on the disgraced executive as the sheriff violently grabbed Paul's arms and dragged him toward the marked cruisers. The corporate parasite was gone. The empire was secure. But as Warren looked back at the smoking ruins of the tenement building, he felt no victory. He walked slowly over to Helen Brooks. He dropped to one knee in the freezing mud, bringing his massive frame down to her eye level. "I'm sorry," Warren whispered. "The boxes, the high school ledgers, the photograph, I couldn't save them. Everything you kept, it's all buried." Helen looked at the billionaire kneeling in the dirt. She reached out with her small, calloused hand and gently rested it on his ruined shoulder. "They were just paper, Warren," Helen said softly, her dark eyes shining in the rain. "I only kept them so you wouldn't forget who you were." She smiled, a warm, ancient grace radiating from her face. "And tonight, you remembered." The cold wind howled through the construction site, carrying the bitter scent of wet soot and shattered brick. Warren remained on one knee, his expensive wool overcoat soaked and heavy with freezing rain. He looked at the mountain of rubble that was once apartment 4B, the tomb of his childhood, the archive of his history, and the foundation of his entire life. "You remembered," Helen whispered, her hand still resting on his shoulder. Her touch was the only thing anchoring him to the physical world. Warren looked down at his own hands. They were trembling. He had spent his entire life building a $2 billion wall of glass and steel to isolate himself from the boy who had once stood in a drafty school cafeteria, terrified of his own existence. He had succeeded in becoming the titan he had dreamed of, but in doing so, he had surgically removed his own humanity. "I spent 30 years trying to outrun that boy," Warren said, his voice raw, stripped of its usual corporate authority. "I thought if I could just make enough money, if I could just reach enough power, I would finally be safe. I thought I had made myself." He looked at Helen, whose eyes held no judgment, only a deep, ancient understanding. "I was never self-made," Warren admitted, the realization settling into his bones. "I was made by you. I was made by a thrift store suit, a bus ticket, and a woman who decided I was worth betting on when everyone else had written me off." He stood up slowly, his bruised ribs aching with every breath. The construction site was quiet now. The bulldozers were silent. The tactical team had retreated to the perimeter. Warren pulled the folded, mud-stained waiver from his pocket. He looked at the signature, the final act of a woman who had lost her home and her life's work to save him from himself. He did not tear it up. He did not file it away in a corporate vault. He walked over to a nearby discarded work light and held the paper over the heat of the bulb until it curled and blackened, watching the legally binding contract turn into ash. "The building is gone, Helen," Warren said, his gaze shifting to the jagged horizon of the city skyline. But the debt remains. He pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, but it still functioned. He dialed a private encrypted number, the direct line to his most senior asset manager. "Transfer all liquid holdings from the Apex Tower Contingency Fund," Warren ordered, his voice once again regaining its strength. But this time, it was the strength of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "I want a new foundation established by sunrise. I want the site of this city block rezoned as a permanent community trust. I want housing, I want education, and I want it to be fully endowed for the next 50 years. He looked at Helen. "I want it named after you." Helen looked at the smoking ruins, then back at the man who had finally returned from his 30-year exile. "You don't have to build a building to honor the past, Warren. You just have to live a future that's worth the investment." Warren nodded. He turned away from the construction site, away from the rubble of his empire, and walked toward the idling corporate car. He left the billionaire behind in the mud. He stopped to open the passenger door for Helen, not as a business transaction, but as a man finally acknowledging the person who had given him everything. As the car pulled away from the site, Warren didn't look back at the skyscrapers. He looked at the reflection in the window, a man who had finally learned the most expensive lesson of his life, that true wealth was never about the monoliths you built, but about the people who had the courage to believe in you when you were nothing. The black corporate car glided silently through the rain-slick city streets. Inside, the silence was heavy, not with the cold tension of the boardroom, but with the weight of a 30-year debt finally recognized. Warren sat in the back seat, his suit ruined, his hands resting in his lap. He wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't reviewing stock valuations. He was looking at his reflection, seeing not the titan of industry, but the boy he had spent a lifetime running from. "Where are we going?" Helen asked quietly. Her voice was tired but peaceful. She had lost everything she had spent 3 decades protecting: the files, the photographs, the history of those she had saved. Yet, she seemed lighter, as if the destruction of the building had finally released her from a long duty. "To a place where the foundation is solid," Warren replied. He looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time in his life. "I spent decades building towers designed to reach the sky, but I never realized that a building without a soul is just a tomb. Tonight, we start the real work." He picked up the phone. He called the director of the St. Jude's Orphanage Foundation, a facility he had ignored for decades. "I am funding the expansion," Warren stated, his voice firm. "I am not just donating capital. I am installing a new board. We are implementing a mentorship program that will track every child until they are established in their own lives. We are giving them the opportunity to bet on themselves." He hung up and looked out at the city lights. He had built his empire on the belief that people were just variables to be optimized. He was wrong. Every billion he had earned was built on the foundation of a $197.86 suit, and a teacher who had seen something in him that he refused to see in himself. The car slowed as it reached the edge of the city, toward the green expanse of the residential district. Warren Evans, the man who moved markets, leaned back and let out a long, shuddering breath. The corporate machine would continue without him. The Apex Tower would never be completed. But for the first time in 48 years, Warren wasn't worried about the future. He had stopped running. He had finally paid his debt. As the car pulled into the driveway of a quiet, unassuming house, Warren looked at Helen and realized he wasn't just returning to his life. He was starting it. He opened the door, stepped into the rain, and for once, he didn't care about the optics or the bottom line. He simply walked to the other side, opened the door, and offered his hand to the woman who had saved him. The storm was clearing. The city was quiet. And for the first time since 1996, Warren Evans was home. The skyscraper he wanted to build was never finished, but the person he had become was finally complete. He looked at the modest house, then at Helen. He realized that the true apex of his life wasn't found in glass and steel, but in the act of being accountable for those who helped him survive. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was a human being. And that was the greatest, most profitable deal he had ever made. Thank you for walking this path with Warren and Helen over these 16 parts. This journey was never really about the money, the buildings, or the power. It was a reminder that we are all built on the shoulders of those who believed in us before we believed in ourselves. I hope this story made you look at your own foundations a little differently today. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to let me know. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into human nature, and let me know in the comments. What is the one act of kindness in your own life that changed everything for you? I read every single one. Thank you for being part of this community, and I'll